Illegal migrants will get brand new council houses or even refurbished council houses as the Labour government is planning to repurpose them with your taxpayer money as part of its plan to close the hotels.
The moment the government said it would move hundreds of people into a military barracks in the countryside, everything changed. That one announcement, short, official, and unadorned, landed like a blow on people who had been worrying for months about empty promises, stretched services, and a sense that decisions were made far away from their towns. By late afternoon, crowds had already gathered outside Parliament and at the gates of local council offices, not because organizers had sent out leaflets, but because neighbors told neighbors on social apps and word spread in coffee shops and on bus routes. And what started as a group of a few dozen swelled into hundreds within an hour as people walked off shifts and left children with relatives to come and be seen. They came because they felt the choice to use barracks showed a new kind of disrespect. That places once set aside for the defense of the nation could be used without local consultation as a stopgap for national policy failures. And that sense of betrayal made the mood raw and immediate. Police put up metal barriers and made a thin first line, but the crowd pressed, testing the edge with hands on railings and voices that rose like a single animal, asking for answers and a halt to the plan. When no clear answer came from Whitehall, the pushes grew harder, and a metal barrier gave way near a side street, and that breach turned an angry crowd into a moving force. Shields came up in response, and officers stepped forward in formation. The contact was close and brutal in the way crowd control clashes often are. Shields slammed against bodies, batons tapped and struck to keep people from advancing, and the air filled with the sounds of shouted orders, the thump of people stumbling, the crack of a window in a nearby shop that had been boarded too late. It was the kind of violence that leaves bruises more than headlines, arms bruised, ribs winded, the stunned stillness of someone pulled out of a crush, and it was enough to make the evening cross a line from angry protest to sustained confrontation. As the first arrests were made, others tried to free those detained, and that pull turned into scuffles that took place in narrow streets where police lines had to move in tight formations. Pepper spray and irritant gas were used in measured doses by commanders who wanted to avoid widespread injury but needed to clear choke points. The crowd answered with fireworks and smoke flares that lit the sky red and made breathing hard, and the odd flare that landed against the police visor sent officers reeling and reforming like a living wall. Outside towns where the barracks were due to receive people, local residents came out in numbers, blocking carriageways with shopping trolleys and timber and pushing moving vans back down lanes. In one small market town, angry groups surrounded a coach depot and tried to stop buses carrying workers, forcing police to clear a corridor to allow staff to drive through. In another place, a group climbed onto the roof of a closed pub to shout down councillors who had been told the decision was already made. These were not neat marches with marshals and banners. They were rough, improvisational, and deeply personal. Officers used kettling to try to stop the spread of the crowds. That tactic trapped hundreds into cramped squares and increased panic, which in turn created pressure points where the police line and the crowd met with real force shields pushed forward. Protesters locked arms and braced. Some fell and had to be pulled out by friends. Medics worked on the edges, treating cuts, breathing problems, and the occasional broken limb. Ambulances had trouble reaching through streets jammed with people, and the sirens were a constant threat of alarm all night. Damage was immediate. Shop windows were smashed by surges that ran down high streets. A line of parked cars was tipped and used as a crude barrier in one area, while in another, a small fire was set to a pile of rubbish and needed firefighters to arrive with police cover. These acts were not organized theft, but spontaneous eruptions as groups tried to clear roads or show fury. Such scenes fed the worst images on social platforms, short clips of a van rocked by a dozen people, a mounted officer urging a crowd back, a window exploding in glass, and those clips pulled in viewers far beyond the towns where events were happening, turning local anger into a national spectacle. Commanders had to choose where to put limited resources, protect critical sites like hospitals and transport hubs, guard the perimeter of the barracks, or try to impose order in the city centers. They could not do all three at once, and that gap was felt by the public as failure. Where reinforcements were sent to one place, another place saw looting or breaches. Where commanders held lines to protect a hospital entrance, a nearby parade of shops suffered broken panes, and the owners called for help that did not arrive quickly enough. Tactics hardened as the nights went on. Police brought in tactical vans and mounted units, and in some towns, trained dogs were used to keep crowds back from certain gates. That show of force calmed some spots and inflamed others, because when lines pushed forward, the crowd merely rearranged into smaller groups and attacked from different angles. The dynamic was relentless. An advance here, a retreat there, a surge to pull an arrested person away. Then a police charge to break that attempt. Each small victory by either side inspired more people to join. Curiosity, fear, and a desire to be part of something larger sent people out in waves, and the unrest kept feeding itself. In the most heated moments, shields were pitted against makeshift barricades. Baton blows landed on arms and shoulders, and people were pushed to the ground and pulled clear by friends. None of these exchanges involved firearms or lethal force, but the physicality was fierce and exhausting, and it left a visible toll on both sides. Political leaders spoke in clipped statements that often missed the texture of what people were feeling. Officials explained the decision in terms of logistics. Hotels were full, costs were high, and military sites provided space that could be managed and secured. Local leaders said they had not been properly consulted and that their communities were already under pressure with housing lists and overstretched services. The gap between national language and local reality formed a deep political fault line. Those who felt unheard brought that resentment to the streets and used force as a blunt instrument to make themselves visible. Opposition voices used parliamentary debates to attack the government's judgment, while some local officials begged for calm and more resources. None of this moved the immediate energy on pavements where people were injured, where shops were smashed, and where families locked doors and watched from upper windows. There were scenes of ugly theater, a police van rocked on its axles by a crowd trying to prevent it from moving, then pulled free by officers who formed a human hedge. A line of riot police advanced in sync up a shopping street and were met by a rush of people who tried to push past. Someone on the edge of the melee tried to pull at an officer's shield, and that moment flashed across social feeds and was replayed in dozens of thumbnail clips. In other moments, there was quiet courage strangers forming a human chain to help an elderly person to safety, local volunteers offering water to coughing faces, a retired nurse kneeling on a pavement to dress a cut. Those small acts kept the night from being only fury and made it painfully human. The use of military sites for civilian housing has a symbolism many found impossible to swallow. Barracks, for some, are linked to national service, to veterans, to sacrifice. The idea that they could be retasked for an emergency housing response without local dialogue made the decision feel like a betrayal in some communities, and that feeling of betrayal fed anger beyond practical objections. People spoke about empty promises for years, about waiting lists and cold rooms, about benefits cut and services reduced. The image of bases repurposed without debate became shorthand for a sense that the priorities of the state had shifted away from those who felt they had earned a stake in the country. As the unrest stretched into a second and third night, practical life frayed. Buses were diverted, schools relocated, after-school pickup arrangements, shops closed early, and insurers started to process claims. The local economy took hits as footfall fell and customers stayed away. That in turn fed a cycle. Fewer people out meant fewer eyes on the streets, which made some business owners more vulnerable to damage or opportunistic theft, which made others more fearful. People began to talk about defense in domestic terms. Neighborhood watches sprung up with the intention of patrolling streets at night. That impulse came from a mix of fear and a sense that official protection was thin. Those loose patrols sometimes helped, sometimes made things worse by introducing confrontations that might have been avoided. When the smoke finally cleared in many areas, the physical cost was tallied. Broken glass, burned signage, damaged vehicles, dozens injured who needed hospital care, and a large number of arrests. The social cost was harder to measure. Trust between parts of the public and institutions was frayed. Debates hardened into camps. Local councils faced a huge cleanup bill and pressure to re-engage communities that felt ignored. For officers who had worked long shifts, the experience was draining. The sense of being thrown into the middle of a political crisis with limited resources and real human consequences left many exhausted and angry. For residents who had stood days outside Parliament or outside council gates, the experience felt like a turning point, a public demonstration that their grievances could not be left to press releases. Looking ahead, there are fewer simple fixes than slogans suggest. Reversing a decision to use a site would calm some places, but would not heal the longer-term grievances about housing, services, and representation. Community leaders argued for a different approach. Local consultation, transparent timelines, improved local services, and targeted funding that dealt with the real pressures behind the protests. Police leaders argued for better resources, clearer command and control, and more emphasis on non-violent mediation to avoid kettling and other tactics that inflamed crowds. Politicians pressed for rapid reviews and inquiries. Social groups called for emergency support for businesses and residents affected. Charities and faith groups tried to step into the breach to offer a calmer space for dialogue. None of these moves would restore trust instantly, but they would be the start of the long work of repair that follows any major rupture between citizens and the state. This story is not about one policy alone. It is about how a single political decision can act as a spark for deeper, long-burning grievances. It shows how the anatomy of a riot is often less about a simple cause and effect, and more about the accumulation of many small failures in housing policy, in local services, in communication, and in political empathy. The clashes between police and protesters were rough and painful and did real damage, but they were also the loudest possible signal that something had shifted, that a slice of the public felt pushed aside and was willing to risk a hard confrontation to be heard. The country can respond with enforcement, with reform, with listening, or with a mixture of all three. The path chosen will shape whether this becomes a one-off crisis or the start of a deeper rupture. For now, the streets remember the nights of shields and smoke, the injured who needed care, and the small acts of help between strangers. Those memories will be the ground on which politics will have to build again, slowly, and with far more attention than was paid before the first coach rolled up to the barracks.